Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Count 5, guilty. Those are the first 5 counts coming out of this jury finding Donald J. Trump guilty on the first 5 felony counts. Reading the rest as we are getting it from our court reporters.
Starting with count 6.
Count 6, guilty. Count 7, guilty. Count 8, guilty. And you'll see on the screen we're tracking ahead. Count 9, guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty. Count 12, guilty. Count 13, guilty. Count 14, guilty. Count 16, guilty. Count 17, guilty. Count 18, guilty. Count 19, guilty. Count 20, guilty. Count 21, guilty. Count 22, guilty. Count 23, guilty. Count 24, guilty. Count 25, guilty. Count 26, guilty. Count 27, we're seeing that on the screen, guilty. Count 28, guilty. Those are the first 28 felony counts here as read by the jury. Count 29, guilty. Count 30, guilty. Count 31, guilty. Count 32, guilty. Count 33 and 34, guilty. That is Donald J. Trump, defendant in New York versus Donald Trump, found guilty on all 34.
And all guilty from inside. This is what we are hearing from our producers. Up to 26 guilty. Now remember, each of these counts could maximum have 4 years in jail. President Trump was
Stone. I believe that is him. I apologize if I got that wrong. But it's many people now just absorbing the news, getting the news.
Netta, and let's while we're seeing this, take us back to the counts. We're seeing now 16 guilty counts. That's more than half. Take us through this.
Yes, let's remember that these counts really run together because these are in relation to 11 checks, 11 invoices, and 12 business
Netta, I'm
ledgers.
just going to interrupt you. I hear that we're getting
falsified
news that it's
so
all
really
34 counts. I think we're getting that news from our...
He's guilty on all counts.
Yes. Yeah. Take us through this.
So there was a little bit of a delay. We got is the laws.
And to a sentencing by the judge, and he reminded the jurors he's the one who decides. But we have the reality now of a former president for the first time being convicted on 34 criminal counts, guilty on all of these counts, whatever conflict or confusion or questions the jury had.
Guilty, another felony charge. Count 25, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 26, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 27, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 28, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 29, guilty, felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 30, guilty, felony charge, falsifying business records. Count 31, guilty, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 32, guilty, falsifying business records in the first degree. Only 2 counts left. Count 33, former President Donald Trump found guilty, falsifying business records. Count 34, guilty. Donald Trump found guilty on all.
In the run-up to the election, we have an elected Democrat who got that accomplished. He got a very friendly judge who ruled his way on every important thing and turned the jury instructions into a roadmap to conviction. So now I assume, with the mission having been accomplished, we'll have more procedural regularity, Shannon. As you just said, there'll be a pre-sentence investigation. There should be a sentencing scheduled, and we'll go from there. But this case will be appealed, and I hope that there'll be more fairness and equity in the appeal than there was in the trial.
And Trey, when these counts, this indictment first came in, there were a lot of people across the political and legal spectrum who said this feels like the weakest case against President Trump. Something changed along the way. How much of this had to do with the guidance from Judge Merchan, whether it was the jury instructions, whether it was the decisions on objections, whether it was the decision not to let in certain witnesses that the defense wanted to call?
All of the above. The verdict is... In our notes here, pardon me for looking down, but our reporters are seeing the defendant, Donald Trump, is looking at the jury, is watching them as they are individually polled. But this is, as Rachel reminded us, someone who has been held in contempt for what he has said and done against other people and witnesses in the system. So I would call that a fairly intense moment, but good for the jury and good for the system to go right through it. Our reporter's also telling us that, well,
based on the self-inflicted wound of putting Bob Costello on the stand as part of their defense, and based on what we heard from the jury this morning in terms of what they asked for, they went right to the jugular in terms of going to the core of the allegations here by asking for evidence to be read back about the August 2015 meeting.
With Stormy Daniels, I mean, I didn't ever think it was going to be an acquittal. Having been in the courtroom, I thought it might be a hung jury, 10-2, 11-1. But the verdict is only the result of what you're given up until that point. So this is not a surprising result to me.
Okay, so Judge, I want to bring you in here. Obviously,
so I'm not surprised.
Yeah, Donald Trump convicted of falsifying business records in the first criminal trial of a former president. I mean, Nick, just take us through how historic this is from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, having been involved in the Watergate case, if President Ford had not pardoned Donald Trump back in 1974, and we had gone ahead and indicted him for obstruction of justice and for falsifying his tax returns, this would not be the big deal it is today. This is a big deal because it is the first, and it is the first time a U.S. president in our entire history has ever been convicted of a crime. And not only that, he could be
took their seats in that courtroom. The Trump team was preparing.
Ironically, as a convicted felon, he may not be able to vote for himself.
Nick, take us through these 34 counts and what they meant. And, you know, you talked a bit about this, you weren't surprised, but why you think the jurors came out with this verdict?
Well, I think the evidence here was absolutely overwhelming. It wasn't just Michael Cohen's testimony. It was David Pecker's testimony that backed it up. It was that tape recording in which Michael Cohen discussed with Donald Trump how they were going to buy the rights to Karen McDougal from the National Enquirer.
Dead misdemeanors that they resurrected into felonies based upon non-unanimous verdicts of crimes that are federal, over which no state court or no state judge or prosecutor has jurisdiction. And in the end, with all the smoke and mirrors and 34 counts and a hooker and a guy, according to a federal judge, is a serial perjurer, we have convicted a former president of the United States of America. We've gone over a cliff. The question as to whether or not America will react to this, whether its numbers will go up or down, I don't know. But I do know what I know. And what I know is that this case is riddled with errors. It is reversible. It will not get through to the appellate division in the First Department in New York, or certainly the Court of Appeals before the next year. And people say, should it go to the Supreme Court? No, it can't go to the Supreme Court unless they exhaust all of the state court appeals. I've spent 32 years in this system, and I am totally disillusioned. You had a judge and you had a DA who literally campaigned on making sure that this president would be indicted. We've got an attorney general who did the same thing. This is a new era in America, and I think it goes against the ilk of who we are as Americans and our faith in the criminal justice system.
Here, they did have to come to a unanimous decision on all of the, and they did on all of these charges. They found him guilty on every single one. Yes, his attorney is moving and saying that Michael Cohen, without his testimony, Donald Trump would not have been found guilty on all accounts. He is saying that the defense believes Michael Cohen committed perjury on the stand. Those are all issues that they'll take up. But for this moment in and of itself, for Donald Trump's trusted attorney and personal fixer for so many years to have been at the center of this case that did ultimately lead to make him a convicted felon while he's in the middle of a presidential campaign is completely uncharted territory, even for Donald Trump. Even with the bravado that you'll see from him, the appeals that you'll see from his legal team, he did not want to be here, and now he does find himself here.
This is also now Donald Trump, who rightly would be proud of being a former president of the United States on his record forever in history.
It wasn't polled. The jury was just polled, which means each individual juror was asked, is this your verdict? And still your verdict. We don't know what that secondary crime was, or a member of the jury could talk. They're not required to. They'll be told that they don't have to, but sometimes members of the jury will talk, and they'll say this was that extra crime that we found.
What do you think, Andy?
The last 24 hours to his supporters that they were going to be throwing him in jail here in New York. And so for him, he has every intention of using this to his a political advantage to the extent he can. And I think the first statement to come from any of his family members since this verdict was issued, I think is an example of that. That would be Don Jr., who was not here at the courthouse today. He was here yesterday. Eric Trump was inside the courtroom, currently still is. And I just want to read for you Don Jr.'s tweet, if I could. Quote, guilty on all counts. The Democrats have succeeded in their years-long attempt to turn America into a third world expletive. November 5 is our last chance to save it. I read that last line, November 5 is our last chance to save it, because Donald Trump himself on the campaign trail has repeatedly suggested that the end of America is near if they does not take back the White House. From our team of reporters and they say Donald Trump
convicted of falsifying business records on all 34 accounts. Again, the first criminal trial of a former or current president, and we've seen this historic moment. It was just about 10 minutes ago, that we heard the jury read out that verdict. Let's go back to our correspondent, Netta Tawfik, who's outside of the courthouse. Netta, if you... Verdict after deliberating for 2 days. This was a unanimous verdict, and there were several possibilities of which way this could go, and this very much was a question of which side made the best argument. It appears that the prosecution came out obviously on top here.
Yeah, and before we get into that, Sumi, I do want to bring you some more updates from inside the courtroom, because Donald Trump is still sat there with his lawyers. Now, we have just heard that sentencing will take place on July 11th in the morning. They did that. The defense requested that a later date because of a conflict with a hearing Donald Trump has in Florida. So Donald Trump will be sentenced in this case just days before the Republican National Convention. So again, Donald Trump continuing to shatter the norms of the nation's highest office. And months away from the election, we are already seeing just how much we are in unprecedented territory, both legally and politically, with this conviction. Also, Sumi, we saw a request from the defense to try to get this case thrown out again. Another attempt by the defense.
Netta, 1 second.
Michael Cohen
we see Donald Trump walking out. Netta, he might be about to say a few words.
Very swiftly denying that.
Let's see if he's about to say a few words. This is Donald Trump walking out after finding out, of course, the jury's verdict, guilty on 34 counts.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged. The people, and they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent, and I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now, from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble, but this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
first ever former American president to become a convicted felon, talking about terrorists and people from mental institutions coming into our country. Donald Trump using the same exact word that he used to explain his defeat in the 2020 presidential campaign. He called that a, quote, rigged election. He called this a, quote, rigged trial. His beef, Andrew, was that there was no venue change and he had to be tried in a place where, quote, we are at 5%. So to Rachel's point, he possesses such a perverted understanding of the rule of law that his belief is that if he were in a place where he wasn't, quote, at 5% political support, there would have been a different outcome.
Well, I think it's a fundamental lack of accepting that people act out of principle and don't act out of self-interest, and that jurors can't.
Unconvicted felons. You have engaged in egregious conduct. It just hasn't resulted in us using the court system to go after you. I think the Biden campaign needs to be really, really careful. His son may be a convicted felon by this time next week. The other thought I had going through my mind is I was in an audience sitting by Tim Scott in South Carolina when Donald Trump went to great lengths to defend New York. Remember, candidate Ted Cruz made an unflattering reference to New York voters.
That's also when he's expected to announce who is going to be the vice presidential candidate. And it's remarkable that obviously we've never been at this moment in history, but the fact that he will be at that convention 4 days after he is sentenced in this case, when we find out what the judge here, Judge Juan Merchan, who he's attacked repeatedly as corrupt without any basis.
Of course, Donald Trump unlikely to face prison in this, perhaps probation, but it will be certainly interesting to see what happens on sentencing.
All right, Netta, thank you so much. We're still looking at these images here. We just heard from Donald Trump speaking there, as we mentioned, and we have Anne-Marie McAvoy and Richard Painter with us, lawyers who can give us some insight as well. I just want to get both of your reactions, starting with you, Anne-Marie.
Well, it's certainly a monumental decision that the verdict is today. It is certainly really earth-shattering what happened today. Undoubtedly, however, there will be an appeal, probably an immediate appeal. The sentencing could get put off after July, although I know they have a July date for sentencing right now.
Yeah.
When you look at it, there certainly are a lot of grounds for appeal here. There's a very good chance that the case is going to be overturned on appeal. And, but the question is, will that happen before the election? And the likelihood of the appeal being heard before the election is not very good. So he
suggest, well, if this is the way the game is played now, both sides are going to start playing it, and as Trey suggests, maybe it's a new chapter in our country, the way we do things.
Yeah, I think it's a new chapter. I feel like, personally, like